consult with one another or with anyone. And the only mistake on such collaboration is the normal one in intellectual life, that you should be able to say in good faith of the final product that it is substantially the expression of your own mind. Any questions about this?
Absolutely. Please.
Well, we don't have a formula about what would count as a good answer. So we're not requiring you to submit to some pre-established formula. So that's freedom. Substance and form go together. You develop the discourse appropriate to the content, rather than trying to guess what the instructors want. If we had a particular genre in mind, a formula, we would specify it. So we desire to be surprised.
Indeed, and just to underline this, needless to say, probably most, perhaps all other classes that you will or have taken at Harvard would say the goal of this exercise, in this case, a paper, but it could be an exam in other classes, is to test your knowledge of the material we have presented to you over the course of the semester. Needless to say, that is not the concern of this course. We are not judging you on the degree to which you have mastered, for example, page 37 of your Nietzsche from week 3. We are asking you to think through these issues, utilizing whatever is helpful for you to think through these issues. Hopefully some of the readings we've assigned will help you to do so. If not, that is perfectly fine. We are out for you to think through these issues, and as Professor Unger said, therefore, the nature of what you will argue and even the genre of how you will argue it will vary dramatically. That is up to you. The goal of the exercise is to help you begin the process, which we hope will be a lifelong process, of thinking in complex ways about yourselves and the world around you. An easy assignment. I laugh, but of course what we do mean is we want this to be an incredibly exciting assignment. Think of it that way. Any other questions, concerns? I'm sure lots of concerns, but concerns that we can help you with, because we want the concerns to be of a productive and exciting nature. Wonderful. Enjoy, and we really mean, oh yes, please. Oh, absolutely, absolutely, yes. You are more than welcome to, yes. So yes, you are not restricted to the readings we've given you, and even if you're using the readings we've given you, please feel free to discuss real-world issues, as you said, for yourselves or the world around us, yes. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Well, we won't both read every exam, but one of us will read all exams.
Mm-hmm. So yes, they will all be read by some combination of Sasha and the two of us. Yes. Great. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Is there any expected format?
No.
None at all. And the reason for this is very simple. If we gave you a format that by definition would force you to stick within it, and we want, on the contrary, for you to think big and then decide how best to express what you're trying to think through, which can vary dramatically. Yes, please. Yeah, if it's a physical copy, I'm not sure. Yeah, I think Sasha's coming soon. If it's a physical copy and Sasha doesn't come in soon, feel free to give it to us, or you can
He'll be
send it
here late.
electronically.
He'll be-
Yeah, he's going to come soon.
He'll
I'm not
be a
sure.
little later,
Yes.
so just give it to
But
him.
yeah. Any other question? Again, I'm sure there are many, but any other question we can help you with? Yes, please. Basically, we want you to wrestle with the issues. And we're thinking of grading as supporting those who are wrestling with them. So, in other words, we're not doing this by definition for this class as a grading rubric based upon the degree to which you demonstrate that you've mastered the material that we have been presenting to you. That's, needless to say, not the goal. So we think of grading as supporting the degree to which you are really trying to wrestle with these issues. I realize that's probably a very unsatisfying answer, but we intend it to be an exciting answer in the sense that we want you to feel free, unlike we suspect probably most of your other classes, to really think big. That's the goal. That's been the goal of this class, and it's the goal of this exercise.
So it could be added that the course is an argument. And the course is not about the readings. The readings are background. And so the most important feature of the papers is that they give sign of serious engagement with the argument, and how you can use that engagement to develop your own position and your own voice. So in other words, it shouldn't be a paper that you could hand in any course, in any circumstance. It should give signs that you have dealt with what has gone on here.
The truth is, an A-level paper for us might get you a failing grade in most other courses. But feel free to think big. That's the goal. And we are trying, with this insanely open-ended question, to encourage you to do so. Think big. Think big and think deeply. Great. Well, should we then turn to, so we left off before the spring break with the end point of our discussion of how we might rehabilitate the project of self-construction. And should we open things up for further conversation on this? And then at some point thereafter, and as always we will play it by ear, we will shift to looking at the next two major
Why don't you
constructions.
lead us into that, Michael? Because the idea was to confront two different versions of that project of nonconformity and self-invention. One exemplified by Nietzsche, and the other that we have been arguing here. So maybe it would be useful if you would begin that, and then we devote part of the class to that.
Absolutely. So I will indeed start this off, the goal of which is literally to start off the conversation. So I will be intentionally brief, but hopefully at least lightly provocative in doing so. So as we have noted, in terms of the potential weaknesses that have played out philosophically and historically in this project, we began with a discussion of Nietzsche, and among the issues we noted with Nietzsche is a fundamental danger in this entire project, wherein if you are focusing on the liberation of the individual, are you in danger, therefore, of creating, hopefully at best, great radical individuals who are nonconforming and creating values for themselves, however, at the expense of quite possibly everyone else, and therefore creating a radical social hierarchy of those few who are able to be and allowed to be and encouraged to be nonconformist and creating their own values, as opposed to the rest of the world that, on the contrary, becomes, to use Nietzsche's expression, the herd. And as we noted, Nietzsche really does not only not give, in fact, has zero interest in giving any kind of political program that would allow that to in any way be generalizable. So I don't think we were being unfair to say it is inherent to his project that a radical social hierarchy would be created in which a few of us could be the radical nonconformists and everyone else would not be. We noted as well that in a different way, but a very similar problem, in the next week, when we looked at romanticism, a comparable concern begins to focus in, wherein if the radically nonconforming individual is always conceptualizing his or her, but again, if we noted, it was primarily his in this literature, social world as restricting and constraining, then it becomes an endless battle of that heroic individual against the social world, a battle that by definition is always ultimately going to be tragically lost, and hence the importance of tragedy as a genre in this literature, and yet the focus is that heroic standing out. Needless to say, playing into the same dangers, albeit at a slightly different level, that we saw with Nietzsche, namely the radical nonconformist, endlessly battling against a social world. The rest of the social world is obviously not part of that, and here again, the social world itself is not being changed to allow this to in any way be generalizable beyond the single heroic individuals. Now, we have noted, if this program can be rehabilitated, it is going to have to overcome those difficulties as well as all of the related ones. And just to quickly lay a few of them out, it would have to work out a political program that would allow for nonconformity not to be restricted to a select few, something like the Nietzschean rereading of the ancient heroic past with a few great heroic aristocrats. That would hardly be an acceptable program. It would also have to redefine what the nature of nonconformity would be, meaning that if nonconformity is an endless battle against social constraints, how would you take out the dangers, which would seem to be pervasive in this entire way of thinking, that you're not questioning, ironically enough, considering the whole goal of it, you're not questioning the whole notion of the radical heroic individual self. Shouldn't that be part of what we would be questioning? And shouldn't that entire vision of the self be an inherent problem that you're trying to think through if you're going to create a social world wherein flourishing beyond those heroic few would be both possible and sustainable? And continuing on that point directly, are you not in danger with this radical focus on the endless battle against social constraints if you're not rethinking the self, of perhaps encouraging what I think we would all have to admit is one of our dangers as human beings, a danger to be narcissistic, egotistical, failing to care and help those around us? And is there not an inherent danger in a focus on this type of radical nonconformity that not only are you not working against those tendencies in humans, you are in fact radically underlining them and perhaps even allowing the figure to see these as part of its goal in its radical position of nonconformity. Now, we also noted some attempts to deal with these problems, and we've noted their failings. And let's just quickly lay those out as well. The standard one in 19th century liberal political thought would be to say, okay, we will define each individual as someone with inalienable rights who can therefore pursue their own happiness as long as it does not overly infringe on anyone else's. And so therefore you create a set of rules that will determine what is allowable for each individual in terms of pursuing their happiness and what is non-allowable because it would infringe upon others. And as we noted, that gets you very scarily close to the utopian visions that we saw in people like Fourier, where it's all about simply saying life consists of nothing but fulfilling our immediate desires, and we want to create a social world where you can do so. And unlike Fourier, who thought we had to organize the world according to phalanxes, essentially what liberal thinking does, again, I don't mean Democratic Party, liberal thinking in the 19th century form of liberal political thought, what it basically does is to take that same vision and simply by scaling up, giving you the same thing. So every individual is free and radically nonconforming, but what that really means is free to fulfill their own immediate desires, and simply by having a whole social world operating this way, with laws preventing us from infringing upon others, the idea is that everyone will ultimately be able to fulfill their desires in that unbelievably restricted definition of what our desires are, and therefore what our nonconformity would be, and therefore what the fulfillment of our own freedom would be. I think we all can agree that that position, although completely dominant now in America, is hardly living up to the goals of the project of self-construction and nonconformity, because it is a radical reduction of what we're potentially able to achieve, literally a reduction to nothing but the fulfillment of very immediate desires, when presumably the whole goal of self-construction is to allow us to become something incomparably greater than simply this thing with a bunch of pre-given desires that need fulfillment. Lots of problems. And that, of course, raises for us the key question of where to go. The key question for us in this class, but as we've noted, this is historically a key question. This entire vision has been playing out for something like 2 centuries, and there is now a perception, self-perception, even by strong supporters of the movement, that it is beginning to die out. Dying out precisely because it has led to a restrictive notion of what individuals are capable of. It has led to an extreme form of narcissism and egotism in terms of the ways we think about ourselves. It has led to a failure to create a world where people in general are able to flourish. It has allowed horrendous levels of discrimination to not only endure but even grow, precisely out of the claim that the focus on the radical individual doesn't require, I mean, should, but does not inherently require attempts to work on that, because that's part of the herd, and a self-perception, therefore, that the project is beginning to die. This would be horrible if this is allowed to continue, because, in fact, I think we would all also agree there are incredibly important values in this project that I suspect we would not want to get rid of. And then the question for us, again, in this class, but historically, is how would we resurrect it? How would we resurrect a notion of self-construction, resurrect a notion of nonconformity that would not play into all of these dangers that we have seen repeatedly, and now, perhaps historically, have played out to such an extent that there is a strong pushback against the entire project? That's our problem. So with that, as a very quick introduction, should we open things up? And
yes, and then I'll make some comments after the class engages.
So yes, so let's open things up, either about the problems, but again, feel free, since you've also all been actively working on this, to suggest responses.
So the main theme in what Michael has just said is that the version of this project that we find in Nietzsche is not the only version. And we have been struggling here to supply the outline of an alternative version, which would be deeper and stronger and responsive to the objections to that version. And we must do that in order to rescue this project so that it can continue to live and be in contest with the other major project that we will be exploring here.
Let's open this up. Thoughts as to where we go now? And let me just underline a point Professor Unger made, because it'll be important for the weeks to come. When we say this, this does not mean that you here and now must say, therefore, this is the right project. The concern is, regardless of one's ultimate decision, we want all of these projects for recreating, or creating, I should even use a more stronger word, creating a world where we can flourish. We want them at their highest philosophical level, because if great projects that have emerged out of the past several thousands of years are allowed to die out because their dangerous sides have taken on such power, we will radically restrict our possibilities as humans to create a better world to come. So regardless of whether you feel the project is one you actively want to support, we should still be working on trying to give it its most powerful philosophical vision going forward. At the minimum, as Professor Unger said, that will allow us to really deal with all of its power and strength when we think of it in opposition to the other projects that we'll be getting to in the weeks to come. Yes, please.
So to me, it seems like when we discuss the idea that everyone will be ultimately able to fulfill their desires in the limited space of lives, and when we criticize this idea, we kind of focus on how limiting
Yes.
but it seems to me that the desires that people have can also be manipulated and changed by others. And when you're saying that like the solution is back out, it made me wonder whether social media plays a big part of it.
Yeah.
That it could really like make people's desire like, hey, watching like rich people live their
Yes.
wealthy lives, we can make everyone want that life, and then
Yes.
it creates a lot of unhappiness.
I think you're exactly right. I think one of our dangers is, I mean, technology can, of course, be used in any way, and so we could and should be using technology in ways to allow us to flourish. I agree with you. The danger is we are not doing so, and I think your example of social media is a perfect one. The way we use social media in practice leads, exactly as you said, to an incredible limiting of our desires, such that our entire vision of what it would mean to live a fulfilled life becomes so incredibly restricted. To give an example we mentioned just very briefly before, but I'll use the question to build on it, 'cause it's a perfectly posed question. Note the degree to which, since literally every single website you have ever gone to has been tracked, every time you go to a website has been tracked, every single thing you have ever bought on the internet has been tracked. And the result of that, because this is the way that the programs are written for things like Google and Facebook, the result of that is everything you see on a computer screen, everything that you are being connected to through social media is based upon algorithms that are charting, to use terms that we'll be getting to momentarily, habits that you happen to have fallen into over time. And the whole goal of those is precisely to be able to sell that information in predictable ways for what you're likely to want to connect to and likely to want to buy, which means the whole goal of social media is to chart out your habits and keep you there. Keep you there so you will feel you are being fulfilled because you can buy the shirt that you like and you can connect with the person in Afghanistan that's just like you, meaning you're being charted, your patterns are being charted, and you're being connected to things and people that perfectly fit your habits. And we feel, isn't this great? I'm being fulfilled. The news stories I want to read, bam. Things I want to buy, bam. People who are just like me I want to connect with, bam. And the result of this is we're Freudians, right? Our desires are restricted to these habits we happen to have fallen into that we feel are being desired. And then returning to the heart of your question, needless to say, we are not fulfilled by any of this. And yet, it restricts the possibilities of, so not only are we not being fulfilled by definition, but even the fact that we feel so unfulfilled, there's nothing in this, in the way it's currently being structured, that would allow us to explode this and lead deeper, richer, more powerful lives. So I think you're exactly right, which comes down to then, how do we deal with social media? And for those of you, for example, to stick with this instance, for those of you in computer science, how would you use technologies and write programs that would do the exact opposite of what we're mentioning? Yes. Lots of questions, not surprisingly. Please, I think you were next. Yes.
So I wanted to ask if you think that this project, if it means that we're always looking at an everlasting project, because it seems to imply very times that because of this project and because of environmental economy, there's always something else to conform to, and therefore that
Yeah, wonderful question. I would say it should be.
Let's
Yes.
restate the question, Michael, because I think not everyone heard it or understood it.
Oh, absolutely. So let me just quickly restate it then. Are we then implying, if not stating explicitly, that this project would be never ending? That there would never be a point where we would actually create a social world where we could be achieving this, because by definition, you would be an endless project of nonconformity, since you're, by definition, not conforming to an existing order, which would, by definition, mean it's a never-ending project. And I think the answer to that is we think yes. Now, I say we because, needless to say, and we've already seen it repeatedly in this course, many supporters of versions of this project that we find very dangerous have claimed to either have achieved or soon to be able to achieve a final moment. So we just mentioned liberal political thinkers of the 19th century. They thought they had it, right? They thought, okay, create a capitalist system under a representative democracy where there are clear laws that define the rights and limitations of everyone's practice of freedom. If you can create that, you'll create a world of nonconformity where everyone can be fully fulfilled. And we've mentioned that's an incredibly dangerous vision because, I don't mean to imply that things like democracy and capitalism aren't things we should take seriously. I mean, to imply that's the final endpoint is incredibly dangerous because it can only work by an incredibly radical restricting of what fulfillment means. Needless to say, Hegel also thought he was on the process of achieving a final result. There was an Prussian bureaucracy. Since we're not actively living under a Prussian bureaucracy, I think we have less difficulty being dubious that that was the final vision. Certainly in communist societies, there have been the claims not necessarily that it's been achieved, but it soon will be achieved, a radical, perfect world. Here too, I think we have seen historically the dangers that play out once you get that claim. So in answer to the question, I would say, and very strongly so, yes. I think the project to fully live up to its goals should commit itself to an idea that it is never ending. Yes, that what you're trying to do is to build in, and even to use an odd word, but I think an important word, to institutionalize it to some extent, that it would mean you would create an institutionalization that would support its endless alteration, change, and recreation. And minus that, it will always involve a dramatic restriction of what nonconformity would entail. Yes, great question. Thank you. And lots of, I think there was one back here first, and then yes, and then there's another one here. So yes, there's plenty of time, so please, yes.
Yeah, I had a similar question, but I can take it further. You mentioned that a flaw of like the Nietzschean vision of nonconformity is that there will always be a radical social hierarchy of the nonconformists and the herd.
Yes.
But if we're using the negative definition of nonconformity, doesn't that mean that there will always be this social hierarchy if you can't? Is there a solution to that in your vision of this?
I think it's a great question. I would say not that we have a solution to it, but I think we would need to endlessly be working for a solution toward it. Because any time we would be comfortable accepting a social world where there would be a few chosen who are allowed to be the real nonconformists, creating values for themselves, truly engaged in self-construction, and a de facto herd who are not, any system that allows that, and chillingly, that those systems have occurred repeatedly, that would have to be broken down. So any attempt to realize this, and again, there'll never be a final realization, but any attempt to realize this, I think, would have to be committed to an argument that that should not be allowed. Because that, by definition, would restrict the whole goal of it, the entire purpose of the project. And yet, I think you're right to ask the question, because we have yet to find a convincing way of doing that. Yes, please. Yeah.
Not so good. Besides the fact that it's never ending, it's not even possible for every person to be a nonconformist because then there's nothing to not conform to.
Mm-hmm.
So isn't, like, by definition built into this project, inherently who are going to conform. There's going to be some elite people who do conform, and it's not. I don't see in my mind a way to get around this process. Otherwise, you're no longer not conforming.
Yes, or to even make the point more dire, is there not a danger that in endlessly claiming we will be nonconformists, even those supposed few that we would hopefully claim to be, we in fact, it's like the example we mentioned 2 weeks ago of people in Silicon Valley saying, we're disrupting everything, and meanwhile, you do the same tired work that I used to do when I was working at McDonald's. And isn't there a danger that in even the claim of endless nonconformity, you're simply conforming to a predefined vision of what that means? Exactly like we saw in Romanticism, where there's a predefined genre of how to be the radical romantic poet, or more recently, the deranged rock star in the 1960s and 1970s, and yet it's a pre-programmed way that you're supposed to act to be the radical nonconformist. So I think you're absolutely right to ask the question, and the way I would like to answer is to say, part of our goal then would be to think of nonconformity as, again, an endless project, where even the claim that you're not conforming is potentially a danger. And so you're endlessly trying to see the degree to which we are falling into rote ways of being in the world, often without our even noticing. And then getting back to the heart of your question, what this would mean, to use an analogy that we'll use in a different way in discussing other projects, but the differences will be key, you're thinking of it something like jazz improvisation, right? I mean, to learn jazz, you learn music, which takes incredible levels of discipline. You are working with structures, and yet the training involves, when it really works, everyone involved is learning to improvise playing off of everyone else, and yet it only works if there's a basic level of understanding of harmonic progression. You're working in the same tonal chord structure that you then can break from. And so think of life as that, right? An endless improvisation, but an endless improvisation that's not the romantic, I'm breaking from everything. By definition, jazz improvisation requires working within pre-given understandings that you are then understanding how to work from and alter and change.
So this question, like the previous question, raises the issue of the missing politics of this project.
Exactly.
It has no political project in the form that Nietzsche and Emerson give to it, which is its most intransigent form. We have to imagine that there would be some political program, meaning, among other things, an institutional program.
Yes.
A program for the establishment of political and economic institutions and of a form of education that would allow this experience of self-construction to be a shared experience, rather than to take the form that it otherwise takes of the great man standing above the herd. Now, in doing that, it seems, in directly answering your comment, we would have to reinterpret nonconformity as something else. For example, we would have to reinterpret it as experimentalism, because experimentalism is a variant of nonconformity that can be shared. And then we can imagine under what economic and political institutions can experimentalism be radicalized and disseminated. So we have a society of experimentalists. So, for example, take as a project for the state in such a society that the state develop arrangements that make it easier for people to change directions and careers and to reinvent themselves in the middle of their lives. That, in principle, is a feasible, practical objective if it were taken as an aim of the policy of the state. And then you would say, we want a whole population of people who, to a greater extent, are able, in practice, to reinvent themselves. And this capacity for self-reinvention would then be the meaning that we would give to nonconformity. And that would be a variant of nonconformity that would be susceptible to being shared. But it does require progressing beyond the form that Nietzsche and Emerson give to this ideal. Yes, back there.
I just wanted to propose a challenge to this idea that there is some project to be had that we are able to come up with this overarching idea of how we should conduct life, and challenge whether we actually are able to conduct life, or are we sort of deterministically like subject to the forces of nature, and has our thought evolved not out of people being necessarily nonconformists, but being placed randomly by chance in their time, in their era, surrounded by the environment, and that's what evolves thought, rather than people purposefully saying, "Oh, I need to be a nonconformist." Basically, I'm trying to see if whether there's a parallel in like genetic evolution, where we have evolved to adapt to things because of our environment, and we don't necessarily purposefully say, "Okay, we're going to only select for strong people" or something like that. It just sort of happens gradually due to the environment. Could there be a similar thing that happens with thought, and maybe it's not so bad? Maybe it's okay that it's futile to try to come up with some overarching notion of the conduct of life. Maybe we should focus on the experience of life, not the conduct of it. If that makes
Oh yeah, it makes perfect sense. And
But
go ahead.
but so I understand, when you say focus on the experience rather than the conduct, are you saying, are you doubting the possibility of agency, that is, of taking control? And are you saying then that the view that we can have is only an explanatory and descriptive view of the determinants of our conduct, which we cannot then hope to shape in any particular direction?
I haven't decided that for myself, whether or not we have agency, but I'm wondering if maybe we should question it a little more carefully.
Yes, because this isn't a deep problem in the most influential versions of this project, that they appear to represent our experience as if it were a miraculous exception to the way things generally work in nature. That's this problem of the dualisms, the successive dualisms that have commanded the agenda of Western philosophy. So I think you're right. So the way that these philosophers have dealt with that is by these dualisms, by saying, well, that's how nature works, but that's not how we work. So the realm of history, of historical experience, would then be somehow a narrower concentric circle, which is somehow exempt from the general determinations out there. And that's obviously an unsatisfactory position.
Do you think that there's still room to create a sense of morality or an institution of morality even without agency, though? Because I feel like that's what the concept of life.
No, I don't. I think that the whole conception of the conduct of life presupposes the reality and the possibility of agency. And then you have to ask how agency is possible. So then you have to have a view of nature for the development of which certain philosophers like Bergson and Whitehead did struggle in the 20th century. So there wouldn't be a miraculous exception. So that the view of nature is that nature is open, that the new is possible in the real natural world, but that the possibility of the new and the acceleration of the creation of the new has certain turning points. So one turning point is the appearance of life. A second turning point is the appearance of consciousness. And a third turning point is the organization of culture. which then, on this view, increase the area of agency. But we have to then develop a view not just of ourselves, but of nature, so that what we think about ourselves not appear to be simply this arbitrary stipulation in which we say somehow we're different, and there's this abyss between us and the world around us.
And just to underline that point, yes, I think one of the ongoing dangers of we as human beings is a danger to think, and therefore in practice to become, beings who simply live our lives according to predetermined visions of what that would mean, in which case we do become the ways that we often will describe the world around us, the way we'll, I think incorrectly, but nonetheless describe animals who simply by instinct live out their lives. And de facto, we in practice are probably more like that than we would like to admit. Nonetheless, I would say historically it is clear that ideas do matter. I mean, humans are clearly capable of creating radically different worlds for themselves. The fact that many of those ideas have turned out horribly doesn't change the fact that they have radically changed the world. But the key question is then, well, number one, obviously, what ideas, but also at a deeper level, as Professor Unger was pointing out, where do we locate the agency to change? So in the project we have been seeing so far, one version of that was to say, let's think of structure and something else, the soul, the spirit that's radically different from the body in the natural world, and that's the basis for breaking, and we've noticed the dangers of that. We will note very soon when we turn to Confucianism, agency will be seen in a very, very different way. And yet, despite there, as we will note, tremendous differences, they're both committed to saying we're capable of changing the world, and usually the ways we change the world tend to fail, and they both want to ask why. Why has our historical record been so bad? Not that we haven't changed the world, but we tend to change it pretty poorly. And what could we do to refine our ability to change it more successfully? And I do think historically, the fact that we've proven capable of changing it shows that we can. The fact that our historical record is so bad shows that we have a lot of work to do in terms of figuring out how to do it effectively.
So maybe this would be a good point to make, for me to make
Please,
some
yes,
remarks.
absolutely.
And just, we're not rushing, so we'll take whatever time we need. A remark made by the philosopher Wittgenstein. He said, when one philosopher greets another, his greeting is, take your time. So this is an essential characteristic of philosophy. And it may seem trivial, but it's not, because our time is very limited, and we're marching toward death. And so it's a harder command to implement than it appears to be. So what we're discussing here is the reconstruction of this project. And let's go back a step. So the premise, or one of the premises of our arguments here in the course, is that among the projects, the approaches to the conduct of life that exist in the world, there are two that are now especially important and influential in the world, in our historical circumstance. This one, that we've been calling the project of nonconformity and self-invention, and the one that we're going to study next, of responsibility and solidarity. And these two projects, to some extent, are headquartered now in the two major world powers. This one in the United States and the other one in China. Although their association with these powers is loose and contingent and susceptible even to a dramatic reversal, as we have suggested before and will later argue. And something very important to understand about these projects and their influence, their power, is that they're not just arbitrary expressions of the history of ideas in these different civilizations. There is a reason why they are the two most influential projects. And the reason appears to be that they correspond to the two most important functional imperatives of the advanced societies. The first imperative is the imperative of the enhancement of agency. The development of these societies, of the advanced societies, requires the capable agent. The agent who can act within the context and, when necessary, beyond and against the context. The imperative of agency is inseparable from the imperative of innovation. The other functional imperative is the imperative of cooperation and the development of higher forms of cooperation. The stronger the disposition and the ability to cooperate, the more successful a society is likely to be. And these two imperatives, the imperative of the enhancement of agency and the imperative of cooperation and of the development of the higher forms of cooperation, are at the same time reciprocally connected. They in some way support each other, but they are also in tension with each other. Because every innovation threatens the established cooperative regime. And so we can ask ourselves, for example, under what set of arrangements and beliefs is this tension between the requirement of the enhancement of agency and the requirement of cooperation attenuated? Or a different way of putting the same question, what cooperative regime is most hospitable to innovation and therefore to the enhancement of agency? So that's, as it were, the social and economic background to this philosophical dispute. It's something real. It's about the real requirements of real social life. It's not just a contest of doctrines. Now, so then we come here, and this is the discussion we've just been having, the question of whether this first project can be rescued and revised in a more powerful form. And we have an interest in formulating it in its strongest possible form. Because if there is to be this contest, we don't want a contest among straw men, among weak positions. We want the contest among the strongest possible versions of each of those positions, because that is the contest that is most likely to be fertile for humanity. Now, so what is necessary then to rescue and revise this project to that end? Seems that there's three tasks. So the first task is to understand clearly the defects of the project in its present form and to address those defects. So I remind you of the general structure of the argument that I tried to develop about these defects. So the first defect is an inadequate understanding of the relation between the self and other people. So self-construction happens only through connection. And there's this contradiction between the requirements of self-construction, that we need the others, but every connection threatens us with subjugation or loss of personal distinction. How can we connect without paying that price? So, and this is not adequately recognized in the canonical version that we have in Nietzsche and Emerson. That is, again, the little Napoleon who crowns himself and deals with the others afterwards. Then the second defect is a failure correctly to understand the relation between the self and the social world. The social world is not just the enemy. No one can be free and great without engagement. But the problem is that every engagement in a particular world seems to threaten us with surrender to that world, and we become the puppets of that world. So the question is, how can we engage without surrendering? How can we be insiders and continue to be outsiders? And that seems to be in part a question about how this world is organized, and in part a question about how we approach the world. Because the reorganization of the social world goes on in historical time, and only our approach to the world is what is, to some extent, under our control in biographical time. Then the third defect of the unreconstructed version of this doctrine is that it has no politics, other than this politics of the great man above the herd. So it would have to have a politics. Now, what is this politics? So we could describe it as a politics of deep freedom. The central theme is transcendence, empowerment. An empowerment in a form that can be shared under certain sets of arrangements. So let me give you just a couple of related examples in the area of political economy. No one is free in this greater sense if he is condemned to do the work that can be done by a machine. Because the machine does what is repeatable, and if you're just acting formulaically as if you were a machine, you're not free. So there has to be a different kind of relation between the worker and the machine. There's a neighboring question. What is the form of free labor? Economically dependent wage labor is not completely free labor when compared to the higher forms of free labor, self-employment and cooperation. But self-employment and cooperation can't readily be reconciled with the imperative of aggregation of resources and scale. So there has to be innovation in the property regimes to make it possible to reconcile aggregation of resources with the ascendancy of self-employment and cooperation as the predominant forms of free labor, and so forth. So I'm just taking from a long list of detailed institutional arrangements the kinds of questions that would be at stake in the development of a politics of deep freedom. And we would have to answer all of these questions. Now, the fourth defect of this unreconstructed version of the project is what I call Prometheanism. So it's this idea that faced with our mortality and our groundlessness and our insatiability, we respond by beating the drums, by this assertion of greatness, of power. It's a kind of triumphalism. And that's an inadequate response, because it turns out that we need this confrontation with death and groundlessness to remain awake and to not confuse the desire for transcendence, for freedom, for deep freedom, with self-deification. One thing is to share in the divine attribute of transcendence, and another is to make the false claim to omniscience or omnipotence. That would be self-deification. It would be a perversion. And then the fifth defect is the emptiness of this project, because we empower ourselves, we become bigger, and then what? What do we do with this bigness? So the problem is that in this version, it doesn't recognize that what gives weight to our lives are our particular connections and our particular engagements in particular domains. Otherwise, it's empty. So we have to have a version of the project that does justice to that. So let's say that's the first task. We recognize all of these defects and we begin to address all of them. Now then comes the second task. The second task is we have to develop a larger view of the world and of ourselves within the world so that these ideas not take the form of being the claim, the arbitrary claim of a miraculous exception. And the problem is, we discussed it before, that the two major traditions in the world history of philosophy, the Greek philosophy of being, leading to modern science, and the speculative monism of ancient India, represented by the West, by philosophers like Schopenhauer, do not provide a secure basis for these ideas. And in the history of modern Western philosophy, from the Middle Ages to today, the dominant philosophical conceptions have been marked by succeeding dualisms. And the most recent form of the dualism is a dualism between nature and history, human history, in which we just say we're different. So we need a different conception. A conception of the world and of nature in which the world is real, time is real, the new is possible, and history is open. And we don't have that conception in a developed form. So that's the second task. Now then comes the third task, and the third task would really be the heart of this attempted reconstruction. The third task is actually to develop the content of an approach to the conduct of life that would express this reconstructed version of the project. So in our tradition in the West, in the modern West, it seems that the two most influential, tangible images of how we should conduct our lives are the image of Christian compassion, interpreted as universal altruism, sacrificial altruism, and the image of romantic adventure. And for reasons that we have at least in part discussed, they're not adequate to this task. So these are the tangible images. Now I'm not talking about what the school philosophy says, which is what are the rules governing our obligations to one another, because that's not directly responsive at all. That's a very oblique response. So how do we develop this concrete approach to the conduct of life? What form does it take? One form that it could take would be in the vocabulary of virtues. So virtues are habitual dispositions to action, and we begin to develop a view of these virtues. So it wouldn't be just the pagan virtues of connection. So those would be one set of virtues. We'd have to reinterpret them, like fairness, forbearance, respect, and courage. These are virtues of connection. So each of them would have to be reinterpreted. So, for example, what is fairness? Fairness is to treat other people in a way that recognizes their interests, the interests that they share with us, in connecting without being subjugated. And then, what's the connection of that to courage? So courage is another in society is not. And courage is not the highest virtue, but courage is the enabling virtue. Because without courage, all other virtues are rendered sterile. The puppets were enslaved. And then we have to have a second set of virtues, which are virtues of purification, in which we render ourselves capable of changing ourselves and of changing the world. And to do that, for example, we need the virtues of enthusiasm and simplicity. We need to be able to distinguish what is central from what is not. And to deliver ourselves to the experiences that really matter and that have transformative potential. And then the highest virtues, the equivalent to the Christian theological virtues of faith, hope, and love, would be the virtues of openness to the other person and to the new. And they have some deep connection to each other. Because our ability to be open to the other people seems to be connected to our ability to be open to the new, not to be just a placeholder in some entrenched social division. So that would be one form that the doctrine would take. Another form would be a narrative of how we can and should respond to different recurring turning points in our lives. So here are two such turning points. So one turning point is what you would call mutilation. So early in life, in the formative period of life, in that person discovers that he can't be everything. He has to be something in particular. But a human being isn't born to be anything in particular. We have this universality, this indeterminacy, which we have to sacrifice and forego in order to develop in a particular direction. This is mutilation. So how is it that we can assume this burden of developing in a particular direction, retaining our universality? We must develop our imaginative insight into the experience of the others, which has as one of its bases the ability to imagine or project what we might have been or might yet become, so that we come to see each other as variations on these human possibilities that we share. Then there comes later a second turning point in all of our lives, which is that a carapace of routine and compromise begins to develop around us. The personality takes a stereotype, rigidified form. That's the character. The Greeks said, character is fate. And there's a concrete circumstance, a set of compromises that we make. And then we begin to think this life that we're now living is the only life that we're ever going to live. And the combination of the circumstance with the rigidified form of the self, the character, becomes our fate. And in effect, a kind of mummy within which we begin to die. So if then life is the supreme good, this openness to the new, which is related to the openness to the other, we have to somehow break the mummy from within. Now, how are we to do that? We can't do it by an act of will. But the will has a powerful indirect role, which is that we can will ourselves into circumstances in which we become more vulnerable to others, to surprise, and to risk, and to rendition, and then we have a better chance of breaking through the mummy. And we break through the mummy so we not die by installments, but die only once. So those are just examples of how the development of the approach to life would begin to take a clear context from Christian compassion or from romanticism, and we would begin to give content to this project. And it wouldn't be just an idea of the grandeur of a small number of exceptional people standing above the herd. It'd be a conception of the transformation of life, of deep freedom, of empowerment, of this sharing in the divine attribute of transcendence. So those to me, this is what I would say are the tasks for the reconstruction of this project, struggling to give it content. And of course, this is not the only way to understand it, to do it, just an example. But what emerges from the accomplishment of these three tasks that I just defined, the criticism and redress of the defects, the placement of the ideas in a larger set of conceptions about the world and about the earth, and then the development of tangible images of how to live. What emerges is a version of this process that is different from the version that is presented by Nietzsche and by Emerson. And that's some such attempt is what we're here provoking you to do for yourselves. Yes. Yes.
And coming to full possession of life, I guess a thing is a desirable thing, particularly in contrast with this other view of having a rigidified character, which I imagine as being like stuck in routines and doing more or less the same thought patterns.
Yes.
And that if you're able to break free from this, then you can only die once. That all sounds very attractive, and it's, I guess I'm sympathetic to that view, but what reasons would you give to say why that is preferable? Like, why is it preferable to be in full possession of life to use this rigidified mind experience of life?
Because I would say, well, that's what we have. So, what do we have? We have life, and we have life. Moreover, only in the present moment. So all that all of us ever have is life right now. The past doesn't exist. The future doesn't exist. But life as it's organized right now is paradoxically not life right now. So living for the future should not mean estrangement from the present, but should mean living in the present as a being not fully determined by the present circumstances of his existence. So the premise at the start of the reasoning is that that's all we have, and that there's this initial movement toward it or away from it. Now, of course, you can press the argument and say, well, why shouldn't we move toward it? Why shouldn't we repudiate and deny life? And at some level, there's no answer to that question. It presents itself as the source of fecundity, of possibility, of novelty. And this is going back to a much earlier argument we had in many ways. One conception of happiness. So in the history of moral theory, there are basically two families of conceptions of happiness. One conception of happiness is the absence of pain. So it's a negation. And we have that, for example, in the philosophy of Schopenhauer. For the two projects that we're taking as central here in our discussion, both invoke a different conception idea that's shared in some way by both of these projects that we're discussing. So I think that the argument in favor of them and in favor of the centrality of life, which they propose, can only be an indirect argument. That is, it's presenting the whole range of forms of experience and value which are accessible on this basis. And then presented and experienced so as to seem irresistible. But in some sense, they must not be irresistible because we know for a fact that they have been resisted. And there are philosophers like Schopenhauer who deny them, and there are people who kill themselves. And so we know that it's possible to resist them. But I don't see any other way in which we could argue for them except to develop in detail what they allow us to possess and to hope for. So I think this idea of the centrality of life is also related to the conception of hope and to a very important feature of the psychology of hope, which is that we think that hope is less the cause of action than it is the consequence of action. So we experience more, we develop this plenitude, deep freedom, empowerment, and then as a result of that we see possibility. So one breakthrough leads to another, and that's how we become hopeful. And the affirmation of the centrality of life is intimately related to this experience of hope. Yes.
So I feel like we need to talk
Yeah.
for example, Facebook is rather coordinated to stay in the same habits rather than
We make it happen for you in your own life, as opposed to making it happening in the life of society. Because there are these two features, right? This is deep question of the relation between morals and politics. So the deep freedom has to do with politics, and it also has to do with personality. And there's this disjunction between historical time and biographical time. So the transformation of society, including its institutional transformation, take place in historical time. But we don't live in historical time. So we live in biographical time. And one way in which to understand these moral projects from this perspective is that they have to make up for the deficiencies of politics. So we don't control, like someone said back here, we don't control what moment of history we were born into. We find the situation. And despite that claim of St. Augustine that all ages are equidistant from eternity, it matters what historical period we were born into and what kind of society, whether we were born into a slave society or a relatively advanced democracy, and what point of the evolution of humanity. And so the moral conceptions inevitably will bear the imprint of this historical placement that we don't control. But in some sense, one of the ambitions of the moral project is to make up for what politics has done. So if society fails to deliver deep freedom institutionally, we have to find a way to deliver it to ourselves morally, despite the failures of society. So it's some relation like that. And that's a detailed discussion. Well, how do we do that? What way of living? And we would begin to enter into the details in ways like the ways I suggested, in the form of an idea about virtues, in the form of a narrative about turning points in life and how to respond to them, and so forth. A fundamental theme in this particular conception of how we live is the theme of vulnerability. So that is a constant feature of the different images in our existing book. There's a price. The price is the heightening of vulnerability. And this is far from being self-evident, because a large part of historical moral theory is about serenity, the opposite of vulnerability. And the message is, keep out of trouble. So the message here is the opposite. Look for trouble. And so that's a very clear context of approaches to life in these conflicting views. Yes.
This is kind of related to Professor Pruitt's discussion of no, what he discussed was if you would see this thing online, buy it, and then realize think that makes you happy and it doesn't. It seems like there are just certain deficiencies in human nature that lead us to think that what we want isn't actually what will make us happy. And I guess you can combat this at the institutional level with things like luxury taxes. And I was just wondering, like, both socially and just individually, do we have an obligation to save, to step in and save people from not from others, but also from themselves and the deficiencies in their own nature?
So say a little more so I understand the connection of that to this conversation.
Like you can't really be deeply free, for instance, if you're physically addicted to something, or
Yeah.
even just psychologically addicted to technology in the way that many of us are. And so, like,
Yeah.
if people are unable to successfully like break free from those desires, is there a social or individual obligation to help people to save people from themselves?
Yeah. So obsession, addiction are very interesting phenomena. So one way to understand them is in desiring anything in particular, we desire it, but always we desire it for the sake of something else. So everything points beyond itself. Our desires are insatiable because of the quality of ours of transcendence, of infinity. And what happens in obsession and addiction is that the horizon beyond disappears. And we're fixated on this little thing, this one feature, this failure. And it can't give us what we want. So it torments us. We need it desperately, we're fixated on it. But because we're human beings, and we are transcendent, we can't get the infinite from the finite. And so the experience of addiction or obsession is a tormenting experience. And we have to free ourselves from it, be empowered, be greater in this way. So that would be the beginning of the approach to it. And everything that is in our experience is subject to this kind of perversion, in which we become a kind of false transcendence, in which we don't understand it as simply a step, but take it as if it were the horizon itself, the thing itself, and it can't be the thing itself. And so that's the relation to the discussion. question about this project. Yes.
Oliver, can you say more about the notion of politics? It seems that the way it's developing the freedom notion,
Yeah.
it's linked to.
Well, let me put it just in an elementary context of the history of ideas. So let's start with the current understanding of the ideological conflict between right and left. So the current understanding is the right are the people who give priority to freedom against the background of the established institutional arrangements, the existing form of the market economy and the existing form of democracy. The left are the people who give priority to equality against that same background. So the contemporary form of the ideological conflict at the end of the second half of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, is what you could call shallow freedom against shallow equality. Shallowness meaning the acceptance of the structural presuppositions. It wasn't always like that. So for the 19th century liberals and socialists, the progressives, the left, the goal was not ever a radical equality of circumstance or of outcome. The goal was a shared bigness. So the idea was the life of the ordinary man and woman will be raised to a higher level of intensity, scope, and capability. And so, as in the liberal thinkers, who were the political version of this project that we're discussing, that was the idea they had. Was also the idea of Karl Marx, of the leftists, of the socialists. So equality in the material sense is secondary, subsidiary to this. So it's like Rousseau writes in the Emile. They couldn't become men, so they decided to become rich. So the conception is that mere material equalization is like a consolation prize for the real thing. And what's the real thing? The real thing is shared bigness, becoming bigger. Let's become bigger together. That was the message. Now, it was defective in that their conception of it was very narrowly framed on the model of an aristocratic ideal of self-protection. Thinkers like Emerson and Nietzsche. And we would have to have more magnanimous, more contradictory idea of what bigness means. And then the method was the method of structural change. So each political sect, the liberals or the socialists, came with a blueprint. Said, implement this blueprint and you'll be free. The system of liberal rights or the state control of the economy. And so what's our situation? We have reason to recognize the primacy of structural change over mere redistribution of resources. But unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we can't believe in dogmatic and definitive institutional blueprints. So we have a problem that has no historical precedent, which is how to recognize the primacy of structural alternatives without succumbing to the structural dogmatism. And we need to have a political blueprint. That's not the object of this course. The political program that would give content to deep freedom. What kind of a market economy in which no one would be of self-employment and cooperation is a form of free labor. The market economy would no longer be fastened to a dogmatic single version of itself, a unique regime of property and contract. Different regimes would coexist experimentally in the same market economy, so that more people could have more access to productive resources and opportunities in more ways. The individual would be secure in a haven of vital protected immunities, a package of resources, a social inheritance. But the reason for securing him in that haven would be to throw open social and economic life to plasticity, to experiment. So we say, we'll give you this security so that you can go out into the store. That's why we give it to you. Not so that you can hide in the haven, but for the opposite reason. That's an evocation of the direction of this project. And that political project is, as it were, the political counterpart to the moral agenda that we're discussing here. The reconstruction of this program of self-invention and nonconformity. But the problem is that that one is in historical time and the other is in biographical time. And we don't control the progress of this political project in historical time. And so part of the burden of the moral agenda is that it has to make up in some way in our individual existence for the failures of politics. And that complicates it. So that's a very schematic complicated question. So what should we suggest?
I think the question
Yes.
you mentioned that in this sort of future that you're envisioning, like no individual would have to do a job that could be done by a machine.
Well, that's just an example.
Yeah. Does that mean like retroactively? Now that we have machines that can do certain economic so retroactively entire human society, like the jobs that they had,
What do you mean by
rendered
retroactively?
meaning are rendered meaningless in the sense that tilling the field is now something we have big
Yeah, but so one view, one version of this idea until recently, there was no way of avoiding that individuals would work as if they were machines, because the machines were too primitive. I think that's false. So, but that's a view that a Marxist, for example, might have. Given the predisposition to economic determinism. So just to place it more concretely so we understand what we're talking about. In Henry Ford's assembly line or in Adam Smith's pin factory, the worker worked as if he were one of his machines. So the machine was a dedicated machine tool, a machine type lathe, operating in repetitious movements. And the worker mirrored the movements of his machine, as if he were a machine also, with that small stereotypical set of machines. Did it have to be that way? I don't think so. That's another debate in economic history and political economy. Now we have a different conception of the machine. So we think everything that we learn how to repeat, we can express in an algorithm. And everything that we can express algorithmically, we can embody in a mechanical device. That's the machine. Then what's the purpose of the machine? The machine is to do for us what we have learned how to repeat, so that we can reserve our supreme resource, our time, for the not yet repeatable. And then the combination of the machine with the anti-machine will be much more powerful than either of them alone. That's the idea, but we're very far away from that idea. And then the question is, what arrangements will be made real? But that way is an example of what it would mean for us to become bigger and freer, be free.
Okay, so I might have a problem. Why is that the ideal?
Well, why is that the ideal? Because it goes back to this conception of life. So life is serpent, surprise, fecundity, the ability to create meaning. If we're scripted, if we're going in a circle, doing the same thing in order, we're not free and we're not fully alive. That's the basic conception. It's related to a conception of the mind. So the conception of the mind is the mind has two sides. In one side, the mind is modular and formulaic. It's like a machine. But in another side, the mind is not modular or formulaic. We can combine everything with everything else. And we can discover something and then make sense of it only retrospectively. That is, the mind can defy its established methods and presuppositions and develop retrospectively the methods and presuppositions necessary to make sense of themselves. Then you can ask, well, is there something in the physical constitution of the brain that determines the relative power of these two sides of the mind? Apparently not. And the relative power of these two sides of the mind is shaped by the organization of society and culture. And in this sense, the history of politics is internal to the history of the mind. So that's just another vocabulary in which to introduce the same set of ideas about freedom and how we achieve real freedom. And I think it's just to suggest that this discussion that we're having about the world is not as if it were cabinet in some specialized department. It opens up into everything else, into our history, politics, of the workings of nature, and even into stuff like machines. But we have to begin somewhere. And so I don't think we need to think of it, right, Michael, as a system in which we have either everything or nothing. We begin from many possible points of departure, and then we progress. It's fantastically distant from the world of what we call the school philosophy. So it's a totally different conception of the subject matter of moral theory. Yes. Well, first of all, we don't agree, right, with this simple contrast of elite and non-elite. So there are different aspects in this very important remark of yours. There is an indispensable place for repetition in our experience, right? So, and this is one of the defects of romanticism. We discussed it. That it's the war against routine or repetition. So that's why Kierkegaard made this wonderful remark that the war against repetition is a war against life. So it's not as if we would imagine that there would never be repetition or routine, but there's some dialectic between what is taken for granted at any given moment and what is not. And that's what we need. It's not like we're going to conduct an all-out war against repetition in any of its forms, because that then leads us to this set of romantic illusions. Yes.
I have a question about the point you made about mutilation.
About
Mutilation.
mutilation.
I guess I'm having trouble understanding why it's important for us to retain our universality. As you said, for us, because that light is finite, there's no way we can everything, right?
Well, so this is the problem. This conception of humanity, which is of course a contestable conception, says we have this characteristic of transcendence and universality. So an individual becomes a physician. But no one is born to be a physician. And it's not as if our history is contained within that. So the complete identification of a human being with a role or a profession is on this view a perversion. And because we're not that. And so we have to be able to make commitments and without delivering ourselves completely to that particularity. That's this problem that I was calling mutilation. And how is it that in taking a particular road in life, we retain our universality? That's the problem. And we relativize the distinction among different things that we could be. And it's as if we cut off our arm, but we have this experience which the medical science describes of the phantom missing limb. So we remember the missing limbs. We remember, we project, or we imagine what we could have been. That seems to be one of the bases of our imaginative insight into each other, into one another. So fate, accident, choice have taken us in these different directions. But we don't reify these distinctions as if they went all the way down. And we develop this imaginative capacity to imagine the otherness of the other people and to see in the other people the denied parts of ourselves. So that's part of the development of humanity. And we have to have a narrative conception of how we are to understand this. Now, if we then have practical arrangements that make it easier to change direction later in life, the two issues of anti-mutilation and anti-mummification come together. They're related to each other. And we have this notion that we have to shuffle the cards. And that's part of retaining this experience of being alive. So those are all examples of how we begin to develop this view in a form that I think is not simply an elitist form. Don't you think?
I do.
That it's a form which, at least potentially, is susceptible to being shared. So that's this idea of this message of let's become bigger together. Now, Michael, do you want to start us off
Sure.
on Confucianism?
Absolutely.
So we can think of it over the week.
Absolutely.
And then, of course, the whole class will be devoted to the second project.
Absolutely. So first, let me put all of what we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks in a larger context. And when I say larger context, I mean a larger context including most, actually, of human history. So very quickly, if you go back a few millennia, you find something that we now put under the label of the Bronze Age, which is a seemingly nice way to frame something that actually dominated much of Eurasia for about 3 millennia. So from roughly the 4th millennium to about the 1st millennium BCE, almost all of the agricultural portions of Eurasia were dominated by local aristocratic elites. In these elite societies, absolutely all positions of power were defined exclusively by birth. All wealth was defined exclusively by heredity. All political positions exclusively by heredity as well. If you were born an aristocrat and at what rank, that would determine who you would be, your amount of power, your amount of wealth. If you were born a peasant, and again at what rank, that would determine how you would live your life and which aristocrat you would be serving. And all of Eurasia was organized this way. We use the term Bronze Age to describe this simply because the major metal of the time was bronze. It's an alloy of tin and copper. The reason it's significant, and the reason we use the word, is that it is an incredibly expensive alloy to get and utilize. So you have to have huge numbers of mines to find the alloys, to create it, and therefore bronze becomes the exclusive control of this tiny aristocratic elite. This tiny aristocratic elite, therefore, have, for example, bronze weapons. They will ride in terms of their warfare on bronze outfitted chariots. They will use for their religious paraphernalia bronze objects. And I say they because, of course, most of the peasantry, also an hereditary defined position, are still using stone and wood to till the fields. And therefore, we call this a Bronze Age to emphasize this is exclusively an aristocratic world in which there is virtually no social mobility of any kind. Moreover, in these religions, and this will follow logically from what we just mentioned, in these religions, all power too, from a religious perspective, is defined hereditarily. There is an hereditary priestly class that serves the hereditary kingly class. That priestly class does sacrifices in usually bronze materials to higher powers that they exclusively have relationships with, and therefore they exclusively confer that power to the kingly class. Exclusively meaning, obviously by definition, the peasantry have no access to the divine whatsoever. They have no access to the priests, no access to the religious paraphernalia. They are peasants outside of the political sphere, the social sphere, the religious sphere. This is the way Eurasia was lived for millennia. Millennia. Why am I mentioning all of this now? Because beginning around 1000 BCE, but more importantly about halfway through the 1st millennium BCE, all of these Bronze Age kingdoms crumble. All of them. And over the course of that millennium, what had been the exclusive way of organizing the world all comes to an end. The Bronze Age kingdoms crumble. The aristocratic classes that control those kingdoms are destroyed. All of the Bronze Age religions are destroyed. And for the first time in Eurasian history, you begin to get, relatively speaking, some levels of social mobility, some possibilities of reorganizing the world, but much more importantly, the sense that it would be possible to truly do so at an extraordinarily radical level. And it's right at this time, beginning around 500 BCE, that you get the explosion of philosophical and religious movements calling for a much more radical changing of the world. Far more radical than just, although this was radical enough in itself, than just the breakdown of the old Bronze Age kingdoms, but calling for the creation of radically new worlds, saying humans all humans are capable of becoming something dramatically greater, and the religions are calling on people to do so. We will be discussing several of these and emphasizing the differences, but here let me also point out immediately one common similarity. All of them take for granted that the previous 3 millennia, in other words, a world based in absolute social hierarchies where you were born into a position and are expected to stay there, all of them accept this is horrific, wrong, and should be changed. All of them are committed to a new religious vision in which potentially everyone would have access to the divinity in some manner, shape, or form, and we'll see that some manner, shape, or form will alter dramatically, but they all share that view, and all share the view that the world accordingly should be radically recreated. Now, you will not be surprised to hear that not all of these ideas are fully successfully implemented, to put it mildly. Therefore, this continues. So that first explosion around 500 BCE has been given the name the Axial Age, A-X-I-A-L, age. It's an early 20th century philosopher of history, Karl Jaspers, who came up with the name. And it's looking at this extraordinary period when you get, beginning on the Western Eurasian side, the emergence of figures like Plato, Aristotle. In South Asia, the emergence of Jainism and the Buddha. And in China, the emergence of figures like Confucius, Lao Tzu, Zhuangzi, Mencius. This incredible explosion and efflorescence of new ideas for us as humans to change the world we're living in. Now, these ideas immediately begin to have an impact. They are also, however, taken over and, for the first time in a theme we will see over and over again, domesticated and built into the emergence of huge empires that come to take over Eurasia, beginning about the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. This then leads to sort of the second stage of these Axial Age revolutions, in which you get the fluorescence of radical salvationist religions, which are either in some manner, shape, or form radicalizing the earlier Axial Age philosophies, or reacting in some extraordinary way against them. Either way, you get an explosion of these salvationist religions. So the one we've been looking at so far has been on the western end of Eurasia, first with the emergence of Greek philosophy in the Axial Age with its conceptions of being, then the explosion of the salvationist religions on the western end, meaning the emergence of things like Christianity and a few centuries later Islam, which involve a radical claim of, instead of simply this notion of being, that you have this radical otherness, soul, spirit, that can break from it, and you get this incredible dynamic developing, and we will see very comparable things playing out in the rest of Eurasia. What we'll be looking at for the next few weeks is, first of all, we will be shifting over to the far eastern end of Eurasia and look at the incredible explosions that begin with the emergence of figures like Confucius and Mencius, and we will see the later development. And then at some point after that, sort of the second or third week, we'll play it by ear, we'll be turning to the exact same time period in South Asia, and looking in particular at the emergence of Buddhism and the tremendous explosion it will have. Now, let me say a few quick points of introduction to what we will be discussing. First, just to underline something we've mentioned before, our goal here will not be to analyze these as instances of cultural assumptions of the areas. In other words, we're not going to be looking at Western views versus South Asian views versus Chinese views. What we're going to be looking at are these extraordinary philosophical and religious views that we are arguing should be wrestled with and taken deeply seriously. There's nothing uniquely Chinese or Western about any of these ideas. In fact, substantially each one of the particular ideas we'll be discussing have actually popped up all over Eurasia. One of the rules of doing comparative philosophy you'll find is that minus something really, really tiny and absurdly detailed, there's no philosophical idea that appears once, and no great philosophical idea that doesn't occur repeatedly. Our goal, however, is to look at the most powerful philosophical expressions of visions of how to live one's life and think of how to take them seriously. And our reason for going back to, in each of these cases, the great figures, is that we want to help you see the terrifying power of these ideas. These are thinkers who want to change the world. These are also thinkers, and we have seen this on the Western side, and we're going to see this for the next few weeks as well, who have consistently, there's ideas, I mean, have consistently been domesticated. And our goal will be to, in a sense, undomesticate them. We want you to take them seriously. We want them to challenge your assumptions. They will. We want you to allow them to break down visions of the world you take for granted. That's why these thinkers are thinking. And our goal is to restore that power and then wrestle with them as we then try to think through these ideas that are still the dominant visions out there and in their undomesticated form should be the ones that we are truly wrestling with. So with that as a quick introduction, for the next 3 weeks, we will look at these extraordinary ideas and